There is a typed page on Blackwell's desk, page 3 of a 6-page speech. The paper is cream-colored, slightly yellowed at the edges from 40 years of archive air. There is a coffee stain in the upper right corner, a perfect brown ring the diameter of a Soviet teacup, and inside the ring, the typewriter ink has bled, just slightly, where the moisture reached the words. The last sentence on that page is written in pencil, not typed. Pencil, because the man who wrote it changed his mind at the final hour and added one line by hand. The line says, in Russian, in shaky cursive, "Ya ukoju z trevogoi," I leave with anxiety. He read those words at 7:32 in the evening, Moscow time, on the 25th of December, 1991. 6 minutes later, the red flag came down over the Kremlin. 7 minutes later, the white-blue-red tricolor went up. The empire that had matched the United States for 46 years, that had built 27,000 nuclear warheads, that had ruled 286 million people across 11 time zones, ended in the time it takes to boil a kettle. 6 empires, 6 final hours. One of them ended at exactly 7:32 p.m. The others ended on different clocks, in different centuries, in different languages, but they all ended the same way. Not from a strike out of the sky, not from a single decisive battle. They ended when the structure could no longer do the 3 things every empire must do to remain an empire: feed its people, make its people believe, pay its bills. When all 3 failed at once, the collapse came in weeks, sometimes in hours, and on the last morning, every one of these empires woke up looking exactly like itself, with its flags flying, its officials in their offices, its currency still circulating, its rituals still performed. By nightfall, none of it existed. This is part 4. There were 3 before this. There will be 1 more after. My name. For those of you who have not been with me through the previous galleries, is Blackwell. I keep the documents, the actual paper documents, the manuscript page with the coffee stain, the renunciation letter signed in pencil at Schönbrunn, the poetry of the last Mughal emperor written on prison paper in Rangoon, the edict that Emperor Chongzhen wrote in his own blood on the morning of the 25th of April, 1644, before he walked to the tree on Coal Hill and tied his sash. I have held them. I have placed them under glass and read them in the slow yellow light of archive lamps in 6 different countries. Today I will show you what they say. We begin where the rains stopped. In the year 802, a Khmer prince named Jayavarman II climbed the sacred mountain of Mahendra Parvata in what is now northern Cambodia and declared himself a god king. He was 32 years old. He had spent his youth in exile in the court of the Sailendra kings of Java, and he came back with an idea that no Southeast Asian ruler had ever fully attempted. He would not merely be a king, he would be the universal monarch, the Chakravartin, the wheel-turning emperor whose breath made the rain fall. He would build his capital at the place where the great river Mekong married the great lake Tonle Sap, on a flat plain ringed by jungle, and he would prove his divinity not through conquest, though there was conquest, but through water. The Khmer would become the empire that bent the rivers to their will. They would dig canals so vast that the early French explorers, 1,200 years later, would refuse to believe the canals were man-made and would attribute them to giants. They would build reservoirs called barais, 2 of them larger than Manhattan, holding millions of cubic meters of monsoon rain, and from these reservoirs they would feed 3 rice harvests a year on land that, before them, had only fed 1. 3 harvests. That is the entire secret of Angkor. That is how a city of 1 million human beings rose in the middle of a tropical jungle in the 11th century, when London still had fewer than 15,000 inhabitants, and Paris was a muddy island in the Seine. Angkor was the largest pre-industrial city that has ever existed on Earth. We know this now because of laser surveys done in the early 2000s, surveys that showed, beneath the canopy, a grid of streets and irrigation channels stretching over 1,000 square kilometers, a metropolis the size of modern Los Angeles, supporting 1 million souls in a place where today there are tigers and silence. The greatest king of the Khmer was Suryavarman II. He came to the throne in 1113 by killing his great-uncle in single combat in front of the assembled court, leaping, the chronicles say, from the back of a war elephant onto the back of his rival's elephant and striking the old man's head from his shoulders with a single blow. He was 18 years old. He ruled for 37 years and built, as his personal funerary temple, the largest religious structure in the history of the human species, Angkor Wat. 200 meters by 250 meters, covered in bas-reliefs that, if you laid them end to end, would stretch for 2.5 kilometers, every centimeter carved with battles and gods and dancing women, all of it built in less than 4 decades by a workforce that may have exceeded 300,000 people. He did not live to see it consecrated. He died in 1150 in a war against the kingdom of Champa, a war he had started and could not finish, and he was buried inside his unfinished temple, and his successor, Yashovarman II, was murdered. And the kingdom slid into its first civil war. Then came Jayavarman VII, the greatest of them all, the king who built Angkor Thom, the walled city, and the Bayon, the temple with the 200 carved faces. 200 giant stone faces, all of them his own face, smiling with the half-smile of a man who knows the universe. He was a Buddhist where his predecessors had been Hindu, and he opened 102 hospitals across the empire, hospitals that fed and treated the poor for free, an act of state welfare so radical that no European monarch would attempt anything comparable for another 700 years. He built rest houses along the imperial roads, one every 15 kilometers, with stone roofs and water cisterns and free rice for travelers. He extended the canal system. He doubled the rice yield. And under him, around the year 1200, Angkor reached the absolute peak that no human settlement on the planet would equal again until the Industrial Revolution. 1 million people, 1,000 square kilometers of urban grid, temples plated in gold, a standing army of 200,000. The Chinese envoy Zhou Daguan visited in 1296, 90 years after Jayavarman VII's death, and wrote in astonishment of streets paved in stone, of women bathing in public pools, of palaces whose tiles were of lead and yellow earthenware, of a king who rode on an elephant whose tusks were sheathed in gold. Zhou Daguan thought he was seeing the strongest civilization on earth. He was. He was also seeing the last generation of it, because by then, the rain had begun to fail. The mechanism that had built Angkor, the 3 rice harvests, the berets, the canal grid, was a mechanism of monstrous fragility. It depended on the monsoon arriving on schedule, year after year, century after century. And starting in the early 1300s, the monsoon began to skip. Brendan Buckley, a dendrochronologist at Columbia University, traveled to the highlands of Vietnam in the early 2000s and cored a stand of cypress trees over 1,000 years old. The tree rings, when he read them, told a story no historical chronicle had recorded. Between 1345 and 1375, Cambodia suffered a 30-year megadrought, the worst in a millennium. Then, just as the system was recovering, a second megadrought struck between 1400 and 1420. The barais cracked, the canals silted. The rice harvests collapsed from 3 a year to 1, and then to none. Population fled. The elite stayed and prayed. By the time the Siamese army of Ayutthaya marched on Angkor in 1431 and breached the walls, the city was already half empty. King Ponhe Yat fled south to Phnom Penh with what was left of the court, and the jungle came in through the broken gates. Within 100 years, no one alive remembered who had built Angkor Wat. The local Khmer farmers told the first Portuguese missionaries in the 1500s that the temples had been raised by giants, or by gods, or by Alexander the Great, anyone but themselves. The empire that had bent the rivers had been broken, finally, by the absence of rain. I hold a fragment of laterite from the wall of the West Barai. It is reddish-orange, porous, light in the hand. There is a white crust on one face, mineral salt, deposited by evaporating water in the last decades before the reservoir failed. That salt is the signature of the death. The empire didn't lose a war, it lost the rain, and now to a continent where the empire lost the gunpowder. Sunni Ali Bair rode into Timbuktu in 1468 at the head of a Songhai army of cavalry and riverboats and slaughtered the Tuareg garrison in a single afternoon. He was a man of terrifying energy. He never slept in a bed, the chronicles say, only on the ground beside his horse, and he ate standing up, and he campaigned without rest for 28 years until he drowned in a flooded wadi in 1492 while crossing a river none of his men could remember the name of. He was succeeded by a general named Muhammad Touré, who took the throne name Askia Muhammad and ruled until he was old and blind, and under him, the Songhai Empire became the largest African state since the fall of Carthage. From the Atlantic coast of modern Senegal, across the Niger Bend to the salt mines of Tagaza in the deep Sahara, Songhai controlled the trade routes that fed Europe its gold. 2/3 of the gold circulating in 15th century Europe came up through the Saharan caravans that Songhai taxed. And the wealth flowed back to Timbuktu, a city that by 1500 held 100,000 inhabitants, 3 universities, Sankore, Jingareber, Sidi Yahya, and a library system holding 700,000 manuscripts. Astronomy, medicine, law, geometry, theology, poetry, the trigonometry of Saharan navigation, the medical treatises of Al-Razi, all of it copied and recopied by hand by a guild of scholars that numbered at its height 25,000 men in a city of 100,000. 1 in 4 adult males in Timbuktu in the year 1500 was a professional intellectual. The leading scholar of the late period, Ahmad Baba, owned 1,600 personal volumes and considered his collection modest by the standards of his peers. Then came the boy on the throne, Askia Ishak II. He inherited Songhai in 1588 after a brutal succession war in which his 3 older brothers were killed or fled, and he came to power at 28 years old over an empire whose provinces had been bleeding revolt for a decade. Across the Sahara, in Marrakesh, the Saadi Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur watched the Songhai succession crisis and saw, in the chaos, his opportunity. Al-Mansur wanted the gold and the salt mines. He had, unlike any African ruler before him, something the Songhai armies had never faced: Portuguese arquebuses. Renaissance gunpowder weapons, 3,000 of them, purchased from European arms dealers and distributed to a force of mercenaries: Andalusians, Moriscos, English deserters, Christian renegades. 4,000 men in total under the command of a Spanish-born eunuch slave named Judar Pasha. In October 1590, Judar Pasha left Marrakesh with his army and 4 months of supplies and crossed the Sahara. The crossing alone killed half his men. He arrived on the Niger River in February 1591 with 2,000 combat-effective troops, exhausted, sun-blinded, dehydrated, but carrying their muskets. Askia Ishak met him at a place called Tondibi on the 13th of March 1591 with 30,000 spearmen, 10,000 cavalry, and a herd of 1,000 cattle that the Songhai planned to stampede at the Moroccan line. The cattle stampeded the wrong way. The arquebus volleys, the first that any Songhai soldier had ever heard, broke the cavalry charge in the first minute. The infantry held for an hour. Then they broke too. Askia Ishak fled south with what was left of the court. Judar Pasha rode into Timbuktu without resistance and demanded a full accounting of the treasury. He found, to his disgust, that there was no gold mountain. The Songhai gold flowed in caravans, was taxed in transit, and was spent on books and architecture and standing armies. There was no Aztec horde waiting for him. He sent word to al-Mansur that the conquest had been a mistake. The Sultan had him recalled and replaced. The replacement was worse. In 1607, the Moroccan governor Mahmoud bin Zarqoun arrested Ahmad Baba and 150 other senior scholars, confiscated their libraries, and deported them in chains across the Sahara to Marrakesh. 1,600 manuscripts were taken from Ahmad Baba's house alone. Most of them never came back. The university system collapsed. The trade routes shifted. Within a generation, Timbuktu was a provincial market town of 5,000, and the Empire of Songhai had been erased from the map of Africa as if it had never existed. The thing that broke it was not a stronger civilization. It was a technological gap of one device, the matchlock musket, that the Songhai had never been allowed to import because the Portuguese, and later the Moroccans, had imposed an embargo on selling firearms to sub-Saharan Africa for over a century. The empire that had taught Europeans how to navigate by the stars was destroyed by gunpowder it had been forbidden to buy. I hold a single page from a Sankore manuscript, recovered from a private collection in Bamako in 2012. It is a treatise on the calculation of inheritance shares under Maliki law. The ink is iron gall, still black, still legible. The page is dated 1543 by the scribe's colophon. 434 years after he wrote it, his handwriting is clearer than mine. We move now to the morning of the 25th of April, 1644, in Beijing. The emperor's name was Zhu Yujian, and he had taken the reign name Chongzhen, which means honorable and auspicious, when he came to the dragon throne in 1627 at the age of 16. He was the 17th and last emperor of the Ming dynasty, a dynasty that had been founded in 1368 by a Buddhist novice named Zhu Yuanzhang, a beggar's son who had risen from a famine village to expel the Mongols and re-establish ethnic Han rule over China. The Ming had ruled for 276 years. They had built the Forbidden City. They had sent Zheng He's treasure fleets to East Africa with ships 4 times the length of Columbus's Santa Maria. They had extended the Great Wall to the form we still photograph today. At their peak in the year 1700, though by then they were already dead and replaced, the territory they had governed held 160 million people, more than the entire population of Europe. And on the morning Chongzhen woke up for the last time, he ruled, on paper, all of it. In practice, he ruled the inside of one palace. The Little Ice Age, the global cooling that gripped the northern hemisphere from roughly 1550 to 1850, had hammered northern China for 40 years. Harvests had failed in 7 of the last 10 summers. Famine had killed perhaps 4 million peasants in Shaanxi and Shaanxi provinces alone. Grain prices in Beijing had risen 600% since Chongzhen's coronation. The silver currency the Ming had based their entire tax system on had collapsed in value because the Spanish galleon trade from Manila had been disrupted by storms and Dutch piracy, and the silver from Potosi that funded the Chinese economy was no longer arriving in sufficient quantity. The state could not pay its army. The army on the northern wall, facing the Manchu Qing, had not received its full salary in 3 years. The army inside, holding the cities against the peasant rebellions, was deserting in regiments. There were 2 major rebel leaders, Zhang Xianzhong in the southwest and Li Zicheng in the northwest. And Li Zicheng, a former postal worker from Mizhur who had lost his job in a state austerity program 10 years earlier, had built a peasant army of 100,000 men under the slogan that he would seize the throne, abolish the grain tax for 3 years, and feed every starving man in China. He had taken Xi'an in February, he had taken Datong in March. On the 23rd of April, 1644, his army was inside the outer walls of Beijing. On the 24th, the inner walls fell, betrayed by a eunuch general who opened the Zhangyi Gate from the inside in exchange for the promise of a court position under the new dynasty. On the morning of the 25th, Chongzhen rang the bell that summoned the Grand Council. He had rung that bell every morning for 17 years. On the 25th of April, 1644, No one came. He rang it again. No one came. He understood. He went to the inner apartments and ordered the Empress Zhou to hang herself, which she did, with a silk sash in her chamber. He ordered his 15-year-old daughter, Princess Changping, to come to him in the Hall of Spiritual Cultivation. He drew his sword. He told her that she had been born into the wrong family, and he struck at her, and he severed her left arm at the shoulder, and she fell, but she did not die. He could not bring himself to strike again. He left her bleeding on the marble floor and went to find his 3 sons, whom he ordered the eunuchs to disguise as commoners and smuggle out through the side gates. 2 of them were captured before nightfall. He then walked alone, accompanied only by a single eunuch named Wang Cheng-en, out the rear of the Forbidden City and up the artificial hill called Coal Hill, called Jingshan, that had been raised from the earth dug for the palace moat. Near the top, beside a crooked pagoda tree, he stopped. He took off his imperial yellow outer robe and laid it on the ground. On the left lapel of his white silk inner robe, he wrote his final edict in his own hand, some sources say in his own blood, drawn from a pricked finger, which is the version preserved in the veritable records. The edict read, "I, feeble and of small virtue, have offended against heaven. The rebels have entered the capital because my ministers deceived me. Let them dismember my body and hang it in the marketplace, but harm not one of my people." He tied his sash to the pagoda tree. He hanged himself. He was 33 years old. Wang Cheng-en hanged himself beside him on the same tree an hour later, so that his master would not be alone in the journey of the dead. They were found, both of them, by a patrol of Li Zicheng's soldiers 2 days afterward, the bodies still hanging, the white robe with the red writing fluttering in the spring wind. Li Zicheng held Beijing for 41 days. Then, the Manchu Qing army, allied with a defected Ming general named Wu Sangui, came through the gate of the Great Wall called Shanhaiguan, defeated Li Zicheng at the Battle of Shanhai Pass on the 27th of May, and entered Beijing themselves on the 6th of June. The Qing dynasty would rule China for the next 268 years. Princess Changping survived the sword wound, lived another 5 years with one arm, was married off to a Qing nobleman by political arrangement, and died in childbirth in 1646 at the age of 17. The pagoda tree on Coal Hill is still there. It was replanted in the 1980s. The original was hacked down in the Cultural Revolution as a symbol of feudal oppression, but the location is exact. The iron plaque is exact, and the date carved on the plaque is exact. I hold a hand-copied transcription of the blood-stained edict made in 1742 by a Qing imperial archivist who was permitted to view the original in the Hall of Literary Profundity. The brushstrokes on the final character of the word __, quote, _0__, min, tremble. They tremble visibly. He was 33. His hand was shaking when he wrote it. The empire that had built the Forbidden City ended with a man writing in his own blood on his own shirt, alone except for one servant, on a hill above his capital, while the bell that should have summoned his ministers rang in an empty hall. We turn to Delhi, 213 years later. His name was Mirza Abu Zafar Siraj-ud-Din Muhammad, and he ruled, in theory, the Mughal Empire of India under the throne name Bahadur Shah Zafar. He had ascended the Peacock Throne in 1837 at the age of 62, an old man already, after a life spent waiting in the harem of his father Akbar Shah II. By the time the throne came to him, it was already a fiction. The Mughal Empire that Babur had founded in 1526 at the Battle of Panipat, the empire of Akbar the Tolerant, and Shah Jahan, who built the Taj Mahal, and Aurangzeb, who extended the borders to almost the whole of South Asia. The empire that in 1700 had produced 24% of the world's economic output and had ruled 150 million subjects, that empire had been disintegrating for 150 years. Aurangzeb's death in 1707 had unleashed a war of succession from which the dynasty never structurally recovered. In 1739, the Persian Nadir Shah had sacked Delhi, killed 30,000 civilians in a single day, and carried off the Peacock Throne itself and the Kohinoor diamond, which would never return. After that, the empire existed mostly as a ceremonial fiction inside the Red Fort, while the actual administration of India was absorbed, district by district, by the East India Company, a private trading corporation chartered in London that, by 1850, had its own army of 250,000 sepoys, Indian soldiers, under British officers. Bahadur Shah Zafar was a poet. His Urdu verse is still memorized by school children in Delhi and Lahore. He was also a calligrapher, a Sufi mystic of the Chishti order, a connoisseur of Hindustani music, and a man who genuinely loved the city of Delhi, which he wandered at night with 1 or 2 attendants, listening to the muezzins and watching the boatmen on the Yamuna. He was 82 years old in May of 1857 when the Indian Rebellion, what the British called the Indian Mutiny, broke out among the sepoys at Meerut, 40 miles from Delhi, over the rumor that the cartridges of the new Enfield rifles had been greased with cow fat and pig fat, an offense to both Hindus and Muslims. The mutineers rode to Delhi on the 11th of May. They forced their way into the Red Fort. They demanded that the old emperor, 82, frail, half-blind, accept the title of Padshah-e-Hindustan, Emperor of India, and lead the rebellion. He refused for 3 days. Then, under threat of death, he agreed. For 4 months, the Red Fort was the symbolic capital of an India in revolt against the British. 20,000 soldiers, eventually, gathered in Delhi under his nominal authority. He had no real military command. The fighting was done by junior princes and rebel generals, while the old emperor wrote sad poems in the upper apartments and worried about the food supply. The British returned in September. They had been gathering forces at the ridge north of the city, 6,000 troops under General Wilson, with siege guns brought up from Punjab. On the 14th of September, 1857, they breached the Kashmiri Gate with explosives and stormed in. The fighting through the streets lasted 6 days. By the 21st, the city had fallen. Bahadur Shah Zafar fled to Humayun's tomb, the marble mausoleum of his ancestor on the southern outskirts. He was found there on the 20th of September by Captain William Hodson of Hodson's Horse, who promised him his life in exchange for surrender. The promise was kept, technically, for the emperor. It was not kept for his sons. On the 22nd of September, Hodson rode out to Humayun's tomb again and demanded that the emperor's 3 sons, Mirza Mughal, Mirza Khizr Sultan, and the grandson, Mirza Abu Bakr, surrender. They came out. He ordered them stripped of their weapons and their fine clothes, loaded into a bullock cart, and driven back toward Delhi. Halfway there, at the gate now called the Kuni Darwaza, the Bloody Gate, Hodson stopped the cart, drew his Colt revolver, and shot all 3 princes through the chest at point-blank range. He left their bodies in the dust at the gate. The next morning, their corpses were laid out at the Kotwali, the central police station, for public viewing. The British wanted the people of Delhi to understand that the Mughal line was finished. The trial of Bahadur Shah Zafar began on the 27th of January, 1858, in his own throne room. He sat on a chair, not on the throne, which had been removed. The British prosecutor, Major F.J. Heriot, charged him with rebellion against the East India Company, of which the Emperor of India was, in British legal fiction, a pensioner and feudal subordinate. The trial lasted 40 days. He was convicted on every count. The sentence was exile for life, transportation to Rangoon in Burma, 2,000 miles from Delhi. He left the Red Fort for the last time on the 7th of October, 1858, in a closed carriage, and he never saw it again. He was 83. In Rangoon, he was housed in a small wooden bungalow on the grounds of the British military cantonment, given a stipend of 11 rupees a day. Denied paper and ink for the first 2 years on direct orders from London. denied paper deliberately so that he could not write poetry. And after 2 years, he obtained, by a kindness of his Burmese jailer, a stick of charcoal, and he began to write his exile verses on the whitewashed walls of his bungalow. He wrote them at night in shaky Urdu script for any visitor or passing servant to read. When the walls were full, the British officer in charge had them whitewashed over, and he started again. He died on the 7th of November, 1862, of a stroke, at the age of 87. The British denied him a marked grave. They wrapped his body in a plain shroud, carried it at 4 in the morning to a patch of ground behind a disused enclosure, dug a pit 4 feet deep, lowered him in, covered him over, and planted grass on top so that no pilgrimage site could ever form. The exact location was lost for the next 30 years. It was rediscovered in 1991 by accident when a Burmese workman digging a drainage trench near the Dargah at Ziwaka Road struck a layer of rotted shroud cloth and old bone. His most famous verse, written in charcoal on the wall of the Rangoon bungalow in 1860, was preserved by a Mughal emigre who copied it down before the whitewash. It reads, "Kitna hai badnasib Zafar, dafn ke liye, do gaz zameen bhi na mili, kuye yaar mein." How unlucky is Zafar, he could not get even 2 yards of earth in the lane of his beloved for his burial. I hold a sheet of his exile poetry, copied in Rangoon in 1861 by a clerk named Mahbub Ali on prison issue paper. The Urdu script slants down toward the right margin, the way the writing of a man with weakening eyes will slant. He could no longer see well enough to keep his lines straight. The empire that had built the Taj Mahal ended with an old poet writing in charcoal on a whitewashed wall in a Burmese cantonment and being buried in a hole at 4 in the morning and being lost for 30 years. We come now to a palace in Vienna and a signature in pencil. The Habsburgs had ruled, in one branch or another, since 1273, when Rudolf I was elected King of the Romans. 645 years. They had been Holy Roman Emperors. They had been kings of Spain. They had ruled the Low Countries and Bohemia and Hungary and most of Italy and, in the New World, an empire on which, for a time, the sun did not set. By 1914, the family had been pruned by history down to a single twin monarchy, Austro-Hungary, but it was still the second largest country in Europe, with 50 million subjects across 11 nationalities, with Vienna as the capital of psychoanalysis and the symphony and the modernist novel, and with the 83-year-old emperor Franz Joseph on the throne, an old man who rose at 4 in the morning, slept on an iron camp bed, and signed every state document himself in a copperplate hand. Franz Joseph had ruled for 68 years. He had outlived his only son, Crown Prince Rudolf, who had shot himself at Meierling in 1880. Crown Prince Rudolf, who had shot himself at Meierling in 1889 in a suicide pact with his 17-year-old mistress, Mary Vetsera. He had outlived his wife, the Empress Elizabeth, the famous Sisi, who had been stabbed to death by an Italian anarchist on a lakeshore in Geneva in 1898. He had outlived his brother, Maximilian, who had been shot by a firing squad in Mexico in 1867 after the collapse of his French-imposed empire there. He had outlived almost everyone he had ever loved, and he sat in the Hofburg every morning at 4 o'clock with a single glass of cold milk, signing papers, the longest reigning monarch in modern European history. He died on the 21st of November, 1916, in the middle of the war he had personally declared 2 years earlier against Serbia after the assassination of his nephew, the next in line, Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. The throne passed to his great-nephew Karl, 29 years old, an earnest young man who had not been raised to rule and who inherited an empire that was, by then, already losing the war. Karl tried for 2 years to negotiate a separate peace. He sent secret letters to the French through his brother-in-law, Prince Sixtus of Bourbon-Parma, offering to abandon Germany. The letters were leaked. The Germans threatened to occupy Vienna. The French refused his terms. He had no leverage. By autumn 1918, the Italian front collapsed at the Battle of Vittorio Veneto. The Czechs proclaimed independence in Prague on the 28th of October. The South Slavs declared the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes on the 29th. The Hungarians declared a separate republic on the 31st. The Poles took Galicia. The Romanians took Transylvania. By the first week of November, an empire of 50 million subjects had ceased to function as a unified state. Karl sat in the palace of Schönbrunn outside Vienna, in the rooms where Mozart had played for Maria Theresa at the age of 6, where Napoleon had slept after Austerlitz, and he understood that he had nothing left to govern. On the 11th of November, 1918, the same day, by historical coincidence, that the armistice was being signed in a railway carriage in Compiègne, he received the German-Austrian Provisional Government's delegation in the blue Chinese salon. They presented him with a document. The document was a renunciation of all part in state affairs. It did not require him to abdicate the imperial title. He never did, and he died 7 years later in exile on Madeira, still officially Emperor of Austria and Apostolic King of Hungary. But it required him to renounce participation in the government. He read it. He took up a pen. The pen had no ink, or the ink had run out, accounts differ. And he reached into his uniform pocket and took out a wooden carpenter's pencil, the kind a junior officer would carry to mark sketches in a field notebook, and he signed the document in pencil. The signature is on the lower right of the page, smudged at the corner where his cuff brushed it before the graphite dried. Within 30 days, 7 successor states had taken legal form on the ruins of the empire: Czechoslovakia, the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, the Republic of Austria, the Republic of Hungary, reborn Poland, Greater Romania, the Italian-annexed territories of Trieste and South Tyrol. 50 million people, 11 nationalities, 645 years of one family on one throne, dissolved by a pencil signature in a salon in a suburban palace in less than a calendar month. Karl was exiled to Switzerland in March 1919. He attempted twice in 1921 to retake the Hungarian throne. Both attempts failed within days, and the Allied powers then exiled him to the Portuguese island of Madeira, where he was given a damp villa with no heating and an income too small to feed his family. He caught bronchitis in the winter of 1922. The bronchitis became pneumonia, and he died on the 1st of April, 1922, at the age of 34, in a bed in a borrowed house in Funchal, attended by his wife, the Empress Zita, who would outlive him by 67 years and who would never remarry and who would wear black mourning every day until her own death in 1989. He was beatified by the Catholic Church in 2004, declared Blessed Karl of Austria on the grounds of his attempts to make peace and the personal piety of his marriage. The empire that had crowned him a saint had been dead for 86 years when the Pope spoke the words. I hold a photographic facsimile of the Schönbrunn renunciation, made from the original held in the Haus-, Hof- und Staatsarchiv in Vienna. The pencil signature is in the lower right. The smudge is exactly where the catalog says it is. It is the signature of a man who, at the moment of writing, knew that the ink had run out, that the pen of his ancestors no longer held what was needed, and that he would have to use whatever was in his pocket to end 6.5 centuries of his family on the throne. And so we come to the speech with the coffee stain. The Soviet Union was founded by treaty on the 30th of December 1922 by the union of 4 republics: the Russian, the Ukrainian, the Belarusian, and the Transcaucasian. It survived a civil war that had already killed perhaps 8 million people. It survived the famine of 1921 in the Volga that killed 5 million more. It survived the collectivization of 1929 to 1933, which killed perhaps 7 million in Ukraine alone. It survived the Great Terror of 1937 and 1938, which executed perhaps 700,000 people by NKVD bullet in the back of the neck, and sent another 2 million into the camps. It survived the German invasion of 1941, which killed 27 million Soviet citizens, a number larger than the entire population of Poland in that year, and which destroyed 1,700 cities and 70,000 villages. It emerged in 1945 as one of the two superpowers on Earth, the only state ever to militarily match the United States. It tested its first atomic bomb in 1949. It launched the first satellite in 1957, the first man into space in 1961, the first woman in 1963. At its peak, in the late 1970s, it held 286 million citizens across 22 million square kilometers, 1/6 of the dry land of the planet, and 27,000 nuclear warheads, enough to end industrial civilization several times over. The economy was, on paper, the second largest in the world. The army was the largest in the world. The Internal Security Service, the KGB, employed more than 400,000 officers and had files on every citizen. It was also broken from the inside and had been for a generation. The economy was a command economy that could build hydrogen bombs and submarines but could not produce enough toilet paper or shoes for its citizens. Oil prices, which had funded the entire welfare state since the 1970s, collapsed in 1986 from $30 a barrel to $10. The war in Afghanistan, begun in 1979, had killed 15,000 Soviet soldiers and bled the budget for 8 years with nothing to show. The Chernobyl reactor exploded on the 26th of April, 1986, irradiating most of Europe and burning, by some economic estimates, 200 billion rubles in cleanup costs and lost agricultural land. Mikhail Gorbachev, who had taken the general secretaryship in March 1985 at the age of 54, attempted to reform the system from within through the twin programs of perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness. The reforms accelerated the collapse rather than preventing it. Once the press was permitted to criticize the state's legitimacy evaporated within 5 years. Once the satellite states of Eastern Europe were told the Brezhnev Doctrine was dead and Soviet tanks would not roll, they all left within 18 months. Poland in June 1989, Hungary in October, East Germany, the Berlin Wall on the 9th of November, Czechoslovakia in late November, Romania, the only one that took blood, in December, with the Ceausescus shot by firing squad on Christmas Day. By 1991, the Soviet Union itself was disintegrating along the same fault lines. The Baltic republics declared independence in the spring. Ukraine voted for independence on the 1st of December with 92% in favor. On the 19th of August 1991, a group of communist hardliners, the vice president, the defense minister, the head of the KGB, placed Gorbachev under house arrest at his vacation dacha in Foros in the Crimea and declared a state of emergency. They moved tanks into Moscow. The coup collapsed in 3 days, mostly because Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Republic, climbed onto the turret of a tank outside the Russian White House and read out a denunciation of the coup to the cameras, and the army refused to fire on civilians. Gorbachev returned to Moscow on the 22nd of August. He was technically still the president of the Soviet Union. In practice, he had been replaced by Yeltsin. The Soviet Union as a functioning state ended on the 8th of December when Yeltsin met the leaders of Ukraine and Belarus at a hunting lodge in the Belovezha forest near the Polish border, and the three of them signed an accord declaring that the Soviet Union, as a subject of international law and a geopolitical reality, ceased to exist. They informed Gorbachev by phone the next morning. He had no power to refuse. The Belovezha Accords were ratified by the Russian parliament on the 12th of December. 11 of the 12 remaining republics signed the Alma-Ata Protocol on the 21st of December, formally dissolving the Union and replacing it with the Commonwealth of Independent States. Gorbachev had 2 days left as president of a country that no longer existed. On the 24th of December 1991, Marshal Yevgeny Shaposhnikov, the Soviet defense minister, brought the nuclear briefcase, the Cheget, from Gorbachev's office and physically transferred it to Yeltsin's office in the Kremlin. The transfer took 11 minutes. There were no cameras. The men shook hands. The 2,700 strategic warheads on standby alert and the 24,000 other warheads in storage passed from one chain of command to another in those 11 minutes. With no public announcement and no ceremony. On the morning of the 25th, Gorbachev sat in his office and wrote his resignation speech in longhand on lined paper, then dictated the final version to a secretary who typed it on the office Olympia typewriter on 6 pages of cream stationery. He went to the studio at 7 o'clock in the evening. The studio was on the 3rd floor of the Senate building inside the Kremlin walls. Channel 1 was set up to broadcast live to the Soviet Union and, via satellite feed, to CNN and the BBC. He sat at a wooden desk. He poured himself a glass of water. The technicians began the countdown. At 7:32 p.m. Moscow time, with 1 billion human beings watching in real time, he began to read. The speech took 11 minutes. He announced his resignation. He listed what he believed had been achieved: the end of the Cold War, the freedom of conscience for Soviet citizens, the right to leave the country, the multi-party elections, the abolition of the Gulag system. He acknowledged what had failed: the economy, the standard of living, the unity of the Union itself. On page 3, halfway down, the typed text breaks off and a handwritten line in pencil follows. The handwritten line reads, in Russian, "Я ухожу с тревогой," I leave with anxiety. He had added it that afternoon, between the longhand draft and the broadcast. The page also has, in the upper right corner, a perfect round brown coffee stain from the cup he had been drinking from while reviewing the text one final time. The historian Serhiy Plokhy, working in the Gorbachev Foundation archive in 2012, found the original manuscript page in folder 17 of box 4, photographed it in high resolution, and published the photograph in his book, The Last Empire, 2 years later. The coffee ring is exactly where I'm telling you it is. He finished reading at 7:43 p.m. He capped the pen. He stood up and walked out of the studio. The technicians were too stunned to applaud. Outside, on the flagpole above the dome of the Senate building, the same dome you can see in any photograph of Red Square, the dome with the small spire and the little flag at the top, the red banner of the Soviet Union, the hammer and sickle on red, was lowered for the last time at 7:38 p.m. It was lowered manually by a single soldier of the Kremlin regiment. There was no ceremony. There was no music. The white-blue-red tricolor of the Russian Federation, the flag of the old empire of the Romanovs that the Bolsheviks had abolished in 1917, was raised in its place at 7:45 p.m. by the same soldier, alone, in the snow. CNN had cameras on the flagpole. The footage exists. You can watch it. The flag goes down. There is a 30-second gap of bare pole. The new flag goes up. That is what the end of an empire looks like, in real time, on television, in color, with a clock running in the corner of the screen. Gorbachev went home to his apartment. He poured himself a glass of cognac. He sat with his wife Raisa, who would die of leukemia 8 years later, and he watched the late news. The late news showed the flag coming down. He turned off the television. He lived another 31 years, mostly ignored by the country he had once led, mostly hated by the half of it that blamed him for the collapse, and mostly forgotten by the other half. He died on the 30th of August, 2022, at the age of 91, in a Moscow hospital. There was no state funeral. Vladimir Putin did not attend. The country he had once governed had by then been at war for 6 months in the same Ukraine that had voted 92% to leave the Union on the 1st of December, 1991. I hold a copy of page 3 of the resignation speech made from the Plokhy archive scan. The coffee ring is on the upper right. The pencil line at the bottom slants slightly downward, as the writing of a tired man's hand will slant. He was 60 years old. He had ended an empire of 286 million people in 11 minutes of reading from a typed page on which he had, that afternoon, spilled his coffee. 6 empires, 6 final hours. The Khmer ended when the rain failed, and 1,000 square kilometers of canal cracked under a 30-year drought, and the jungle came back through the broken gates. The Songhai ended when 2,000 muskets, carried across the Sahara by a Spanish-born eunuch, broke 30,000 spearmen in a single morning at Tondibi, and Ahmad Baba's library was loaded into chains and walked north into the desert. The Ming ended when Chongzhen wrote in his own blood on his own white robe and tied his sash to a tree on Coal Hill above an empty city, his bell ringing in a hall where no minister came. The Mughal ended when an 83-year-old poet, denied even paper for 2 years, scratched his exile verses in charcoal on the whitewashed walls of a Burmese bungalow, and was lowered at 4 a.m. into a hole that was deliberately left unmarked. The Habsburg ended when a young man in a salon in Schönbrunn signed his renunciation in carpenter's pencil because the ink in the imperial pen had run out. The Soviet ended at 7:32 p.m. with a coffee stain on page 3 and a sentence written by hand. They didn't fall because someone was stronger. They fell because they could no longer feed, believe, or pay. 3 things. That is the entire pattern. The mechanism is identical across 13 centuries and 4 continents. When the food fails, when the legitimacy fails, when the money fails, when all 3 fail at once, the empire has weeks, not decades. And on the last morning, every one of them looked exactly like itself. The flags were flying. The clerks were at their desks. The currency was still circulating. The rituals were still performed. By nightfall, none of it existed. The structure looked eternal until the last day. It always does. This was part 4. There will be one more. I am Blackwell. The documents are on the desk. The coffee ring is still there.